Good morning or good afternoon. My name is Mrs. Hunter. I'm a new resident at Westminster Woods, and I have the privilege of reading to you this morning. I thought first I would say and talk to you a little bit about stories. And as you already know, a story has a beginning, a middle, and an end. You all knew that. And I have some pictures here just for review. And first of all, you know that for a story, there's an author. And sometimes it might be you who writes a story. So the author is the person who writes the stories or the books. And then, of course, you know there's the illustrator, and that's the person who draws the pictures for the paper or the book or whatever. Then you have characters in the story. It could be you if you're writing the story, some kind of person, or it could be an animal who's talking. And that brings me to fiction. Fiction is a book that tells a make-believe story, and I'm sure you've read lots of those. Those are fun books. And then we also have nonfiction, a book that shares facts and information. And those are good too because you learn a lot. And finally, well, I guess there's a couple here. The setting, the place the story takes place. And, you know, that can be anywhere in the world, of course, or outside of the world. And then you have an event or a scene. And that's an important thing that happens in the story and the place where it happens. And sometimes you might have a prop or an object in the story that's very important. So there's lots of things that happen with a story. And I love stories and books, as you will probably know, if I get to see you like once a month. I brought a story, and it's a chapter book. So I won't get to read the whole book to you this time, but I hope that in the future we'll be able to share some of the rest of this story because it's a good one. It's called Goonie Bird Green by Lois Lowry. What a name, huh? Goonie Bird Green. There was a new student in the Watertown Elementary School. She arrived in October after the first couple months of school had already passed. She opened the second grade classroom door at 10 o'clock on a Wednesday morning and appeared there all alone, without even a mother to introduce her. She was wearing pajamas, cowboy boots. She was holding a dictionary and a lunchbox. "Hello, Mrs. Pigeon," the second grade teacher said. "We're in the middle of our spelling lesson." "Good," said the girl in the pajamas. "I brought my dictionary. Where's my desk?" "Who are you?" Mrs. Pigeon asked politely. "I'm your new student. My name is Goonie Bird Green. That's green with a silent E at the end. And I just moved here from China. I want a desk right smack in the middle of the room because I like to be right smack in the middle of everything." Here's a sketch of Goonie Bird Green. Actually, I have, this might be something of what she looks like. I'll leave that right there. The class stared at this new girl with admiration. They had never met anyone like Goony Bird Green. She was a good student. She sat down at the desk Mrs. Pigeon provided, right smack in the middle of everything, and she began doing her second grade spelling. She did all her work neatly and quickly, and she followed instructions. But soon it was clear that Goony Bird was mysterious and interesting. Her clothes were unusual, her hairstyle was unusual, even her lunches were very unusual. At lunchtime on Wednesday, her first day in the school, she opened her lunchbox and brought out sushi and a pair of bright green chopsticks. On Thursday, her second day at Watertown Elementary School, Goony Bird Green was wearing a pink ballet tutu over green stretch pants, and she had 3 small red grapes, an avocado, and an oatmeal cookie for lunch. On Thursday afternoon after lunch, Mrs. Pigeon stood in front of the class with a piece of chalk in her hand. Today, she said, we are going to continue talking about stories. Yay, the second graders said in a very loud voice, all but Felicia Ann, who never spoke, and Malcolm, who wasn't paying attention. He was under his desk, as usual. Goony Bird, you weren't here for the first month of school, but our class has been learning about what makes good stories, haven't we? Mrs. Pigeon said. Everyone nodded, all but Malcolm, who was under his desk and doing something with scissors. Class, what does a story need most of all? Who remembers? Mrs. Pigeon had her chalk in her hand in the air, ready to write something on the board. The children were silent for a minute. They were thinking, Finally, Chelsea raised her hand. Chelsea, what does a story need? A book, Chelsea said. Mrs. Pigeon put her chalk down. There are many stories that don't need books, she said pleasantly. Aren't there, class? If your grandma tells you a story about what she did as a little girl, she doesn't have that in a book, does she? The class stared at her, all but Malcolm, who was still under his desk, and Felicia Ann, who always looked at the floor, never raised her hand, and never spoke. Beanie said, my grandma lives in Boston. Kiko said, my grandma lives in Honolulu. Ben said loudly, my grandma lives in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. Tricia shouted, my grandma is very rich. Class, said Mrs. Pigeon. Shh. Then in a quieter voice, she explained, another time we will talk about our families. But right now, she stopped talking and looked at Barry Tuckerman. Barry was up on his knees on his seat, and his hand was waving in the air so hard he couldn't make it wave anymore. Barry, Mrs. Pigeon said, do you have something that you simply have to say? Something that cannot possibly wait? Barry nodded yes. His hands waved. What is so important? Barry stood up beside his desk. Barry Tuckerman liked to make very important speeches, and they always required that he stand. My grandma, Barry Tuckerman said, went to jail once. She was 20 years old, and she went to jail for civil disobedience. Then Barry sat down. Thank you, Barry. Now look at what I'm writing on the board. Who can read this word? Everyone but Malcolm and Felicity Ann watched as she wrote the long word. Then they shouted it out. Beginning. Good, said Mrs. Pigeon. Now I'm sure you all know this word. She wrote again. Middle, the children shouted. Good. And can you guess what's the last word? She held up her chalk and waited. end. Correct, Mrs. Pigeon said. Good for you, second graders. Those are the parts that a story needs: a beginning, a middle, and an end. Now I'm going to write another very long word on the board. Let's see what good readers you are. She wrote a C, then an H. Mrs. Pigeon, someone called. She wrote an A, and then an R. Mrs. Pigeon! Several children were calling now. She turned to see what was so important. Malcolm was standing beside his desk. He was crying. Malcolm needs to go to the nurse, Mrs. Pigeon said. Mrs. Pigeon went to Malcolm and knelt beside him. What's the trouble, Malcolm? She asked. But he couldn't stop crying. I know, Nicholas said. Nicholas always knew everything, and his desk was beside Malcolm's. Tell me, Nicholas. Remember Keiko showed us how to make origami stars? All of the second graders reached into their desks and their pockets and their lunch boxes. There were tiny stars everywhere. Keiko had shown them how to make origami stars out of small strips of paper. The stars were very easy to make. The school janitor had complained just last week that he was sweeping up hundreds of origami stars. Malcolm put one in his nose, Nicholas said, and now he can't get it out. It's a picture of Malcolm. Is that correct, Malcolm? Mrs. Pigeon asked. Malcolm nodded and wiped his eyes. Don't sniff, Malcolm. Do not sniff. That is an order. She took his hand and walked with him to the classroom door. She turned to the class. Children, she said, I am going to be gone for exactly 1 minute and 30 seconds while I walk with Malcolm to the nurse's office down the hall. Stay in your seats while I'm gone. Think about the word that I was writing on the board, character. A character is what a story needs. When I come back from the nurse's office, we are going to create a story together. You must choose who the main character will be. Talk among yourselves quietly. Think about interesting characters like Abraham Lincoln or Christopher Columbus or Babe Ruth, called Ben. Yes, Babe Ruth is a possibility. I'll be right back. Mrs. Pigeon left the classroom with Malcolm. When she returned 1 minute and 30 seconds later without Malcolm, the class was waiting. They had been whispering, all but Felicity Ann, who never whispered. Have you chosen? She asked. The class nodded. All of their heads went up and down except Felicity Ann's because she never looked up. And your choice is? All the children, all but Felicity Ann again, called out together. Goony Bird Green, they called. Mrs. Pigeon sighed. Class, she said, there are many different kinds of stories. There are stories about imaginary creatures like Dumbo, Tricia called out. Raise your hand if you want to speak, please, Mrs. Pigeon said. But yes, Tricia, you are correct. Dumbo is an imaginary character. There are also stories about real people, like from history, like Christopher Columbus. She stopped. Barry Tuckerman was waving his hand again. Yes, Barry, do you have something very important to say? Barry Tuckerman stood up. He twisted the bottom of his shirt around and around his fingers. I forgot, he said at last. Well, sit back down, Barry. Now I thought, class, that since Christopher Columbus's birthday was soon, she looked at Barry Tuckerman, who was waving his hand like a windmill again. Barry, she said. Barry Tuckerman stood up again. We already know those stories about Christopher Columbus, he said. We want to hear a true story about Goony Bird Green. Yes, Gooneyberg Green, the class called. Mrs. Pigeon sighed again. I'm afraid I don't know many facts about Gooneyberg Green, she said. I know a lot of facts about Christopher Columbus, though. Christopher Columbus was born in We Want Gooneyberg Green, the class shouted. Gooneyberg, Mrs. Pigeon said finally. How do you feel about that? Gooneyberg Green stood up beside her desk in the middle of the room. Can I tell the story? She asked. Can I be right smack in the middle of everything? Can I be the hero? Well, since you would be the main character, Mrs. Pigeon said, I guess that would put you in the middle of everything. I guess that would make you the hero. Good, said Gooneyberg. I will tell you absolutely true story about me. So we've got to hear about who Gooneyberg Green is. So this story is about a second grader. I hope I will be able to read to you in probably a few weeks another chapter about Gooneyberg Green. Bye for now.